Welcome back, Treatment-Free Beekeepers. This is episode 49 of the Treatment-Free Beekeeping Podcast. I'm your host, Solomon Parker. Good to see you all again. Today, I have another first for the podcast. No, it's not a first. I guess it is a first, because it's the first time I've done two guests, one on the phone and one on Skype. So, hey, there's a new thing. It's not the first time for two guests. That happened once before, I think. Anyway, today on the podcast, I'm going to be talking with Marshall Dudley and Joe Bessetti on small cell. So if you've heard of small cell beekeeping, that is the idea that you use either smaller foundation or, to a certain extent, foundationless methods to return the bees to a more natural and biodynamic sizing of the cells. Today's podcast is brought to you as usual by the patrons at patreon.com. We have just now finished the drawing for a swarm trap built by our very own Jason Bruns. You've heard him here on the podcast before talking about swarms, and the winner of the swarm trap is Laura Gunyon, who is a patron at patreon.com/TFB. And if you would like to support the podcast and the Facebook page and the forum and all the other stuff we do here, you can do that at patreon.com/TFB, and you will be entered in the next drawing that we have. So get interested in that. It's a good thing, because what we do here is we try to teach people about how to keep bees without chemicals and treatments and the real way to save the bees. So another thing you can do to help out the podcast is go to your favorite podcatcher or iTunes or wherever. And if you have the opportunity to rate this podcast, I haven't really asked for ratings much in the past, but if you can rate the podcast, give it 5 stars, give it 6 stars. Be honest though, maybe it's worth 8. Rate the podcast if you could on iTunes. It helps it become more visible, and we can reach more beekeepers this way. So without further ado, here is Joe and Marshall and myself, and we are talking about small cell beekeeping. Joe and Marshall, welcome to the podcast. Good to see both of you. Let's start with Marshall first. I don't know Marshall. I do know Joe, so we can get to him later. Marshall, okay. Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself, where you are, and how you got into beekeeping?
Well, I lived in Memphis, and I was, in junior high school at the time, and we had just moved out to an area of North Memphis called Frazier, and a few blocks away there was a fellow that had some beehives in the back. And I found that interesting, went down there, and he kind of became my mentor. And the next Christmas, I got a beehive kit from Kelly. And I think that was 1960 that I got the beehive kit. And been keeping bees pretty well off and on ever since. Back then, you drop them in a box, and it didn't matter whether you looked at them, what you did. They lived, they thrived, and everything else. Not quite that easy anymore, but it seems to be getting better than, say, 10 years ago anyway.
And where are you located again?
I'm in Knoxville, Tennessee now.
Okay. And Joe, I've met you in person a few times. We have some other activities that we do together. You're located in Wisconsin?
Yeah, I'm in Cottage Grove, Wisconsin, small town just east of Madison. And I've been keeping bees here for, 6, 7 years. I guess now it probably adds up to. I got interested in bees because my grandfather had bees when I was a kid back in the 80s. And, of course, when parasitic mite problems came through, that was pretty much the end of his beekeeping. I was pretty young then. We didn't see a lot of bees around the farm there for quite a long time. We see a lot more now. I don't know if anybody's keeping bees there. That was in western Pennsylvania or not, but I've always kind of stayed interested, and when I finally got settled enough myself that I could get back into it here about 8 or 9 years ago, I bought a hive and bought some bees and got started.
So the subject matter for today's podcast, and the reason why I have more than just one guest on here, is small cell. Small cell is something that I was taught when I first started beekeeping from D. Lesby and Michael Bush and a few other people who were into it at the time, but haven't maintained a public presence, or at least an internet presence. So I honestly don't know where to start on this. Joe, do you have any ideas on where to start and how to get into the concepts of small cell?
Well, I can tell you what turned me on to small cell. I was just keeping bees on foundation that came with the kit that I got when I got the first bees for a fair number of years. And then I started catching swarms. And I caught a swarm one summer and put it in a top bar hive, foundationless. And I was a little surprised at how small these bees were and how small the comb was that they drew out. And up until that moment, I had no idea there was any difference in cell size. I figured the standard foundation that came with that kit was what everybody used and was standard for honeybees everywhere, but that's obviously not the case. And this had been a feral colony that had swarmed out of a tree on a property in western Wisconsin. So that was my introduction to cell size as a variable. I mean, I won't call it small cell. I think small cell is really a tool that we use now by providing foundation with a specific size imprint on it. What we're really dealing with as much as anything is just a sizing of the bees that might be more natural or could arguably be any number of other things. That's what introduced me to it. Started doing a few websites and, of course, or doing web searches, and, of course, ran into Michael Bush, and got involved in the annual meeting that D has, and here I am now. I'm keeping bees on small cell foundation. But it wasn't because somebody told me to do it. It was because I found bees surviving on their own in the wild, and they were small. And the bees that I was keeping in a box in a kit that somebody had told me to use that I bought, my bees weren't surviving. And so it seemed natural to make that change.
So you found bees of a certain size in the wild, and therefore you went looking for information as to why that was.
Absolutely.
Marshall, how about you?
Well, I'd been, keeping bees, and around the year 2000, maybe it was 2001, I lost all my hives to the mite. And what I did was, everybody, was using chemicals, and I'd been chemical free the whole time, and I refused to use chemicals. So I kind of got on the sidelines for about a decade, and would go to the TV&I fair every year where they had this big honey exhibit with the beekeepers. And I talked to them and I asked, how are you dealing with the mites and everything? And come about 2012, some of the beekeepers there were saying that they weren't doing anything for mites except for a sugar shake. And I also found out that there was a beekeeper, a commercial beekeeper in Knoxville, named Arnold, Test Arnold, with the Arnold Beekeeping Supply Service or something like that, that was supplying treatment-free bees. So I gave him a call, and he said he'd been treatment-free for 5 or 6 years, and his survival rate, he said, was about 85%, and he said most of those were those that he was taking out and putting in orchards and all, and they were actually getting poisoned. So I got a nuke from him, I believe it was in 2012. The only thing is, he was not small cell. So I brought him in, had some foundation that I had put him on, which was 5/4, the large cell stuff, and found the organic Yahoo beekeeping group with Dudley, and she's a very strong proponent of small cell. So I decided I was going to go small cell. I ordered some foundation and moved all the large cell stuff to the side and put the small cell in the center. Well, as it happens, the queen was a little on the fat side. And when the honey flow started and they really started feeding her and she started really laying eggs, she couldn't fit her butt down in the small cell cells. So she ended up only laying in the outer frames. And I also used my large cell foundation up in my honey super. And she'd want to go up there and lay. And I struggled with that the whole season. By the time winter came around, the population was really, really down because they were just, we're not raising broods in the brood nest and everything, and they didn't survive. So I started catching swarms then. I never bought never bought a package or a nuke or anything after that and caught swarms. And I put everything after that on small cell foundation, and they've done remarkably well. It's kind of interesting now. There is one place where if I caught the swarms, they didn't do all that well, and they were larger bees. So I was apparently catching bees from some beekeeper, but they just jump right on the small cell and they'd survive. And I'm having great survivability with the small cell, and I think that's a large part of it. I think being feral population, survivor stock, locally adapted and everything is also another large part of it. But over the last 2 years, I've only lost one hive, and I went through the winter last year with 8 hives.
Great. For myself, like I said, I started out from the beginning with small cell. I basically attached myself to Dudley's methods, and I now recommend that other people, new beekeepers especially, when they start out, find somebody to basically just copy, be an apprentice of sorts, and do it the way that you see a quote-unquote master doing it. And once you then get some ideas of your own, once you follow their ideas and then start to get some ideas of your own, then you can modify those methods and figure out what works best for you. So I honestly have never kept bees on large cell foundation. I don't know the difference. I have been, and part of the reason for trying to put this podcast together, this episode together, is that because there's not much scientific evidence out there for treatment-free beekeeping, or not treatment-free beekeeping, I'm getting off subject, for small cell beekeeping, I haven't specifically promoted it as much. And there's a couple reasons for that. Number one is, on the Treatment-Free Beekeeping Facebook group, consistently when I do polls of what kind of foundation system people use, the vast majority, 75%, use some variation of foundationless, be that foundationless Langstroth or Warre or top bar hives. And then another probably 15% use conventional cell size, and then maybe 10% use small cell or some variation thereof. So I believe in small cell. I have a theory. I have my theory, which is a modified version of Dudley's theory, on why it works and why the small cell studies don't bear that out, or we'll get into it. We've got some time. Joe, why don't you're sort of the expert on the studies and read a lot of that sort of stuff. Why don't you give us a little primer on the studies and what they say?
Well, that's always a tough nut to crack, and I've been looking for ways to talk about research in a way that kind of brings to light this cell size debate in a different way. There's a couple different ways of looking at it. If we just look at the research papers themselves that looked at small cell comb or small cell foundation compared to large cell comb, large cell foundation side by side, the vast majority of them, and there's only a couple of them, but the ones that have been done at least in the last 10 years here in the U.S., there's three key studies. One was in Georgia, I think Barry Delaplane. One was in New York, was Tom Seeley, and I can't remember, I apologize, can't remember who did the third one, but they all kind of did the same thing. They all took commercial honeybee stock that had been treated, put it on small or large comb, gave them 6 to 9 months time, and counted mites. And counted, took other various data, but they really all concluded the same thing. They all started with the same thing. They all did the same thing. I'm not surprised they concluded the same thing, that they didn't see any difference in mite numbers. Of course, everybody points to those three studies as evidence that small cell doesn't work. But, there's another half dozen or more studies that actually do show some evidence that small cell works. And if I flip the coin over and look at the other side, I'd say there's probably thousands of studies done by those same academic researchers that say small cell doesn't work, and thousands of studies that prove that large cell doesn't work with those same bees. So I got to say, based on everything I've read, that small cell doesn't work on its own with commercial bees, at least in a short term. But gosh, if you put good bees with some genetic resistance to mites on small cell comb and do a few other things, I think that's really the formula. I think it's small cell in combination with natural resistance mechanisms, in combination with good forage, good healthy bees, and a little bit of time. This is what I keep coming back to anyways. We know large cell doesn't work with conventional bees. Why would we expect small cell to work with conventional bees if the problem is partially the bees?
If the problem is the conventional bees.
And I do agree with you there. If they took small cell bees and started with them and then put them on large cell comb, they might suddenly find that the ones that were surviving fine might not survive at all once they're on large cell. But, they never run that study. And also, genetics is really funny, because what you'll do is if you play with one attribute, the genetic switches for other attributes will switch and will change. And what they're doing is they're taking a queen that was raised large cell, putting her on small cell comb, and expecting her to behave as if she was raised small cell and be the smaller sized queen, which in itself is could really be a problem. They need to at least go down a generation and have a queen that was successful as a small cell queen before putting her on small cell, because what happens is all the genetic switches of the eggs that she's laying are going to be just like their large cell bees, even though they're laid in small cell. Whereas the queen that's been raised on small cell and is going to be a little bit smaller and everything may have these genetic switches set so that, for example, her offspring will have tighter fitting exoskeleton where the mites can't get in there and suck blood. Other traits such as behavioral traits like ankle biters and everything may become more pronounced. But the studies, as far as I'm concerned, are really not doing it right. Plus, they're also looking at the wrong metric. For me, I really don't care what the mite level is. If my bees are thriving and they survive, I don't even look at the mites. So, they're looking at a metric of mite level. And then there's one other thing that I I think it was Elgin.es or something like that, has talked about, and that's the training where you'll have the ankle biters, the groomers that will train other bees how to groom. And the mites will appear to be larger, of course, compared to the bee size on a smaller bee. So that may make grooming a lot more effective for the smaller bees. And these are things that studies have really never looked at that I'm aware of.
Yeah, unfortunately, the vast majority of the research has always been done on standard large cell foundation. And
right.
Only a very few studies have been done with small cell foundation at all. And even fewer of those have given the bees any time at all to adapt or change as a result of being on small cell comb. And I think there's something there that the research community has really been missing and or ignoring for a long time. Popular topic of discussion, or people bring it up now a lot, is epigenetics. That's
exactly.
You're not changing the gene sequence, but you're changing the expression of those genes.
Right.
And
what I was calling the switches, the expression
absolutely.
is probably the correct term for that.
Yep. Another angle on this is certainly, this observation that when we take bees off foundation, let them draw comb, vast majority of bees that start out 5.4 millimeter get smaller naturally when they draw natural comb. And these swarms of bees that I'm getting in the wild that draw 4.9, 5.0 millimeter in my area here in Wisconsin, they probably started out large decades ago, and they naturally get smaller. And I think that's something that should be telling us all something. If the bees naturally get smaller, it's not that they want to get smaller. They're genetically programmed to get smaller. And if the bees in the wild, and if the bees in the wild are smaller and are surviving, maybe there's no controversy here at all. Maybe it's natural selection that we need to focus on. If we end up with wild bees that are naturally selected, obviously, that are smaller, then I think it behooves us to think about cell size in our own hives as a tool for engaging in natural beekeeping.
Well, I caught a swarm last Monday, and the hive I put them in was missing a frame. And I went in like the next day to put the frame in, and they'd already built about 40 square inches of comb right off my inner cover. So I had to cut that off. And when I got inside, I measured it, and they were building 4.8 right out of the box, or right in the box.
Right in the box, yeah. Well, I'm totally in agreement with you guys, both with the concepts of epigenetics and especially with the metrics of the studies. We look at studies like that and we make this kind of judgment call of whether it works or it doesn't work. But really, you have to slow down for a minute and look at what works, what that means, what it works or doesn't mean. What doesn't working means. And then in this case, what we're looking at with these studies, and I feel the main flaw in them is the fact that they're simply looking at mite level. And like Marshall said, I have really no concern about mite levels as long as my bees are doing well. And so I have a theory on how we can explain how the mite levels are the same, or maybe even mite levels can be greater in small cell. One of the studies showed that not a huge difference, but a small. I don't even know if I don't recall if they found it statistically significant or not, but the small cell bees showed a little bit higher mite count. And the reason why I think that is because when we get back to a natural cell size for the workers, what we do is we shift the the predation of the mites from the workers to the drones. Everybody knows the typical figure given for workers hatching out, emerging from their cells as adults is about 21 days. And a number of people have observed the small cell bees hatching out a day or two earlier than that. Meanwhile, the drones hatch out at about 24 days. So what that allows the mites to do is to have some extra time for that phoretic female mite to get into that cell, lay her first egg, which becomes a male. She then mates with that male, and then she begins laying fertilized eggs after that. And I forget the exact numbers, but every certain number of days she can lay a new egg, and the longer that cell is closed up, the more eggs that she can lay and the more adult mites will be created. So naturally, if you are limiting the time that the worker is capped in there, you're going to limit the time that the mite has to reproduce, to the point where she might not even get that first female mite or the second female mite to be into adulthood before the bee emerges from the cell. And if she can't do that, then she's basically failed in her reproduction. Excuse me. Meanwhile, while she does that same thing, if she does that same thing in a drone cell, she's going to have a much greater chance of getting 2, 3, maybe even 4 new mites out of the reproduction process. And so it's going to shift. If the mites, and we've all observed that mites naturally go for drone rather than worker, if given the chance. We see that with methods like drone comb removal and whatnot. So what I believe the small cell really does, and we can say, I tend to refer to small cell as specifically 4.9 millimeters, but with foundationless and natural comb, you can get a bit smaller than that as well. But if we're pushing the mite load onto the drones can handle it, because those drones, when they hatch out and they're damaged, are just going to get ejected from the hive, and that doesn't hurt the hive. Meanwhile, if a worker gets ejected from the hive, then you've lost the amount of work that worker was able to do. And if you lose too many workers, you start having weak hives, and you start having mite crashes and things. So I believe that small cell hives are better able to handle the mite load and able to withstand a higher mite load. And therefore, if you're to do a mite test on a small cell hive, you would find either the same number of mites or even a greater number of mites in a small cell hive. And the important thing, I feel, is that we look at survival and not mite counts.
Absolutely. The only metric they should really be doing on the initial studies is survivability. Once you prove survivability is better, then you do the studies to find out why. Instead, they study the why without even proving the theory to start with. So it's kind of backwards.
They feel that they disproved the theory. So, small cell, from an academic standpoint, is dead science because they claim it doesn't work. They've concluded it's done. But all they really did was they counted mites and showed there wasn't a difference. If they had very carefully looked at mite population entry into drone cells versus mite population entry into worker cells, they may very well have observed, now I anticipate that they will, similar to Solomon, your thoughts on this. I believe that a higher percentage of the mites key to the drone cells in small cell bees, and that a larger percentage key to workers in the larger cell bees. And it's really a function of the mites choosing where they can be most successful in raising daughter mites. I think the research community could very well look at this and start to better understand why they got the results they got in those studies, instead of just dismissing it entirely, because there's way too many people using small cells successfully for it to be ineffective.
There's also one other aspect, and this I think came out of Sweden initially. It may have been Denmark, but one of the Scandinavian countries, where the bees do teach the other bees how to groom. And if you watch the population on a hive, which ends up grooming, I think you're going to find in many cases the mite population will build up to a level, a quite high level, that would become somewhat frightening. And then all of a sudden the bees would just start grooming like crazy and knock it totally back down. Now, if you're doing a study and you see this huge buildup, and then you terminate the study or you treat or whatever, you never really get to the end result that these bees are going to, at some point, aggressively groom these mites off once they become a problem. It's sort of like, if you see a bug in your house, you may ignore it. You see 2 or 3, you may ignore it. But if you see 30 or 40, you're going to call in the exterminators or something and get the problem taken care of. And the bees tend to focus on what they see as the main problems. And if the mite level's low, a lot of times I think they just kind of ignore them until they hit a threshold. And then they start teaching each other how to get rid of them, and then they aggressively groom them and knock them way, way down.
And, Marshall, in response to that, I have observed in my hives early in the season, and there aren't a lot of mites, but early in the season I don't see a lot of hygienic behavior. Opening, the uncapping of capped cells and removal of the pupa. Even though there are drones in the hive. But when the bees stop rearing drones in the fall in my hives, which is usually sometime around beginning or middle September, when there aren't any drones available for that hive or for that mite population to reproduce in, I see a shift. And I suddenly, for about a week or two, see a lot of uncapping of worker cells in the hive. And I think that shift is the mite population shifting from drones to workers. A lot of times, right before that happens, I'll see the bees clean out frames of drones, just tossing drones out left and right, uncapping cells and pulling them out at the purple eye stage before that. But then when there aren't any there's no drone brood in the hive, and those mites start going into the worker cells, they get really hygienic really fast. And I think that's in response to a higher percentage of those cells being infested with mites. The bees don't spend or waste, let's call it waste, time dealing with one mite here and one mite there. But when that mite population shifts from the drone brood to the worker brood, they really focus on hygienic removal and opening of those cells. And I see a lot of mite drop during that period of time, which is usually in late August through September.
Right. Well, mite drops is another study or another concern. And that is when you count mite drops, it's really hard to know what's going on. If you have a hygienic hive, which is grooming 10 times as many mites as naturally drop, and you look on the board and you see twice as many mites on the hygienic beans, you might think they have twice as many mites, when really, in effect, they probably have only about 1/5 as many mites. So the tools that are used a lot of times to determine mite loads, like mite drops, it's really the drop rate times the number. And if you don't know what the drop rate is, and grooming really skews that to be quite high if they're doing heavy grooming, then it really doesn't give you any idea what the mite load itself is.
I guess that's me.
Yeah.
I got to get used to this doing shows with more people. I just done one before. Anyway, I have, I forget who talked about it earlier, but I have actually done some little micro studies of my own, looking at taking a piece of comb and pulling out drones and workers and counting the number of mites that I found. And again, this has confirmed everything that we've been talking about here. What I did was I was trying to start some medium hives, and so what I would do is I would take 2 mediums and drop a deep nuke in there. And of course, as you know, that leaves some space down at the bottom of the deep frames, and the bees would almost tend rather to build that out first before they would start on the other frames, on the medium frames. And so when I would get in that hive to take those deep frames out of there, I would pull that, 3-inch strip of comb off the bottom of those deep frames, and there would be usually some major sections that were worker and some other sections that were drone, and I would count it. I would take some tweezers and I would literally uncap the workers and the drones and pull them out and count how many mites there were on each. And so you can, I forget the exact numbers. You can find, it's an old blog post on my blog at parkerbees.blogspot.com. But what I was finding was that somewhere, I forget the exact numbers, but I think out of 75 cells that I pulled out of the workers, there were only 4 or 5 mites that I found in those cells. Meanwhile, when I would pull out the drone cells, there would be around 1/3 of the drone cells would have a mite in them.
Mm-hmm. I've observed pretty much the same thing, Solomon.
Have you seen anything like that, Marshall?
I've actually never done that.
Not a problem. There's another one that I regularly, and I'm sure Joe's heard this because he's heard me speak before. But what I talk about in several of my talks, I bring it up because it's kind of an important observation for me, was I had a hive one fall that had a super heavy mite load. So I went in early November to do the final checks on all my hives, and I was seeing mites all over this hive. There's mites literally crawling across the comb. I could see mites in the brood. I could see mites on bees. Like, this is a pretty severe mite load. And so I gave up on the hive. I just thought it wasn't going to make it. The mite load was too high. It was going to die over winter. And so I didn't bother doing anything to it. I didn't feed it. I didn't close the entrance down at all. I just gave it up. That's typically how I deal with disease problems like that. Everybody knows that I'm just kind of a live and let live or live and let die sort of guy, because I know that the next year I have really efficient methods of splitting, and I catch a lot of swarms, and so losing a hive I don't feel like I've lost much when I lose a hive, and so I let them die on their own or survive on their own. And so this hive, this hive. I gave up on it, and the funny thing was I had 11 hives going into winter that year, and I lost one, and it wasn't that one. That one actually survived, and the next year I was totally surprised that when I got into it the next spring to start my spring beekeeping activities, because there wasn't a sign of any mites anymore. They were all gone.
Right. By the way, when I said I put them on 4.9 foundation, I do use a lot of foundationless. I put new swarms on 4.9 foundation, but that's mainly to get some nice straight combs and everything in there. And then by the time I have 5 or 6 frames, I go ahead and switch to foundationless. And, that saves me having to put foundation in and keeps my combs straight and where I want them.
And I think that's becoming a lot more common of a practice. I do that a little bit, and I'm fixing to do it even more because, when I go out and put up a swarm trap, Jason Bruns, who's been on the show a couple of times, he does all foundationless, and so when he goes out and puts up a swarm trap, he has to make sure the trap is nice and level so that the comb gets drawn straight in the frames. I don't necessarily want to worry about that. I just want to stick the thing on the tree and move on to the next one. And so, and the same thing with crooked hive stands and stuff. I want to be able to stick stuff in there and just leave it. On the other hand, once the hive is established and on a nice level hive stand and that sort of stuff, then sure, yeah, I'll put foundationless frames in there and between two other straight frames and get them drawn straight, and then they're just as good as any other frame.
Right.
Is there any more stuff about the theory that we want to cover before we move on to the practice?
Yeah, I'm thinking here. There is some research out there that I have found that supports an increase in hygienic behavior in bees managed on small cell comb as compared to bees of the same genetic background on large cell comb. I really look at this as a multifactorial problem, right? And if you had a heart attack last week and you're talking to your doctor and he's telling you things you can do to prevent the next heart attack, he might suggest 4 or 5 things, right? Mm-hmm. He might suggest that you get some more exercise, eat better, maybe take some medicine for your heart. He might suggest you lose some weight, and he might suggest you reduce the amount of stress in your life. But at the end of all those suggestions, he doesn't ask you, so Solomon, which one of those things are you going to try? If we look at mite management and research, it just dumbfounds me as to why everybody expects a silver bullet for dealing with mites, and why we can't all look at all the possible factors and all the factors that people claim are successful as being cumulative, as working synergistically together. You have small cell comb, you keep small cell bees, you still lose a colony now and then to mites. It happens. You keep bees that are genetically predisposed to hygienic behavior or grooming or any of these other things. You're still going to lose some hives, probably some to mites, and there's lots of ways you lose hives other than mites, which is another matter altogether. Every hive that dies, of course, is due to mites these days. But
yeah, don't I know it?
Yeah, I just if my doctor's giving me advice on how to prevent my next heart attack, I think I'd probably do everything. And if people are suggesting to us things we can do to naturally manage mites in our hives, why wouldn't we do everything? And that's what I do. Small cell isn't a magic bullet for me. It's part of a system that I feel improves my bees' ability to deal with the stress of pests. And in addition to everything else I can do to manage their health, keep them healthy, keep them away from pesticides, and it just works.
I did recently recorded an episode with Dr. John Keefus, who came up with the idea of bond beekeeping, live and let die. And it's very interesting to listen to him. And Kirk Webster has a version of this also, saying that he will actually say that some people have too many mites and some people like him have too few. And he will bring in hives that have mites to expose his bees to mites because he wants to have that exposure to be able to maintain their level of varroa resistance, because his mite levels are so low that he's concerned about not maintaining varroa resistance in his bees. Now, I probably don't think that's like a huge problem. He's probably just playing that up to be funny. But it's an interesting thing to think about.
Yeah, I think the bees, once they have it genetically, it does take a certain number of mites, a certain infestation level to activate it. I think that's a theory and a theme that I keep seeing over and over again. And a lot of times you hear the arguments that, that people should be counting mites and doing something if the mite number gets to a certain level. But if I look at the research, for example, I've been reading up on the Russian honeybees, and there's a lot of really good research that's been done on the Russian honeybees. But those hives, in the first couple of years they were kept here in the U.S., mite levels in those hives were reaching 4,000 and 5,000. Population of mites are 4,000 and 5,000. And that kind of population of mites is going to have enough mite drop and give you enough mite count on a sugar roll or an ether test that it would suggest to somebody who's predisposition to treating that they're going to lose their bees if they don't treat. But those bees survive largely in spite of it. And these are the Russian bees. These aren't my bees. These bees are kept on large cell foundation and were able to survive extremely high mite levels. And those studies also show that those bees have a wide array of strategies for dealing with mites, not just one thing. They're not just biters. They're not just hygienic. They're not just VSH. They came to us from, where nature selected them in Russia. They came to us with a whole host of abilities in dealing with the mites. Right. And the capability of managing to survive in spite of, and even thrive and produce good crops of honey in spite of relatively high mite numbers. So I think this really extreme focus on mite levels and decision making based on mite levels, whether it be a decision to treat a colony if that's what you do, or even among the treatment-free people, a decision to requeen a colony just because the mite numbers get above a certain threshold is a huge mistake in my opinion.
Yeah, there's also one other aspect that we really hadn't discussed at all, and that's the deformed wing virus. And, there's some studies, and some people say that the mites themselves don't end up killing the bees. It's the viruses they carry, of which the deformed wing virus is a major one. And there are at least two different varieties, a type 1 and a type 2. And apparently type 1 causes the deformed wings and early death of the bee, whereas type 2 seems to really have no symptoms whatsoever, but ends up immunizing the bees or the colony against type 1. And, some of the genetic factors may be whether the bees tend to breed a high level of this type 2 as opposed to type 1. Then again, it could be environmental. It may be, to a large extent, what's in the area. And, that's a focus of research also that I think needs to be explored that has hardly been touched on. It's been touched on a little bit, I think, in England, and that seems to be about it.
Yeah, that's a strategy or a resistance mechanism called super infection exclusion, where infection with one virus subtype confers resistance to another highly virulent, highly damaging virus.
It's basically like a vaccination where they used cowpox to keep people from getting smallpox.
Yeah, and it's different than a vaccination, but I think your point is well taken. I think researchers should be looking to natural selection, not just selecting for activities that reduce mite count, but natural selection also is going to select for bees that are naturally resistant to the viruses that are the bigger threat to survival in itself. And deformed wing virus is just one of the viruses that's spread by mites and can become problematic.
Is there anything else we want to talk about before we move on to how to go to small cell?
I'm ready to go to practical application.
Yeah, we've been a little all over the place here, but
we've been a lot all over the place.
A lot all over the place. Well, you can't really talk about one of these things without all the other things creeping in. It's not a one-factor solution to beekeeping. It's a many-factor solution. That's how nature works. Nature selects for anything and everything that produces survival. And I think that's the kind of beekeepers we should be, is to select for and utilize anything and everything that nature provides us to keep our bees healthy and thriving. So let's move on now to how to move to small cell, huh?
Yeah. Okay. Well, I'll just go ahead and start from where I started. When I started beekeeping, again, it was Dee Lesby's operation that I was looking at, because she was about the only one who was successful at the time and who was on the internet and readily available to me. When I started, Michael Bush had just had his first winter where he didn't lose all his bees when he had gone on to small cell, and you can hear him talk about that. There's plenty of videos on YouTube. You can hear about that. So what Dee Lesby did back in the 80s and maybe early 90s, I forget exactly, but what she did was to do what's called shakedowns, which is basically where you take a hive of bees and you shake all the bees off of them, off of the frames, into a new hive with just foundation and force them to rebuild from scratch. Looking back at that now,
was she using foundation? I thought she was using foundationless because the small cell foundation wasn't available then.
I don't know that she ever used foundationless. She had her own foundation mills made back then at great expense.
That is my understanding as well. She shook them down onto small foundation.
And she even had, I've recently discovered that she even had a big batch of Duragilt foundation custom made. And those of you familiar with Duragilt, it's terrible stuff. It's a plastic sheet that has wax laminated on either side with the cell bottom in it. And the major downside is once that plastic sheet is exposed, the bees will no longer build on it, and so it eventually has to be thrown out. But that's a separate issue, because I was down looking at her hives this a couple months ago and found all these Duragilt foundation frames. And I was like, "What's this going on?" Oh yeah, she had a custom batch of Duragilt made.
But on the shakedowns, she has the advantage down there that she has a really long season and not a terribly long cold winter. If I were to shake bees down twice during my summer here in the north, they wouldn't produce a drop of honey, and unless I fed them heavily, wouldn't make it through the winter. So I think shakedowns are a little excessive for where I'm at. Sure.
I believe that she may have incurred higher losses than she would have had she not done shakedowns, which is why I recommend the method that Marshall did.
Yeah, the great thing about a brand new swarm of bees is they are driven to produce worker comb. They don't draw out much drone comb until they have enough worker comb to work with. And they will usually draw out the smallest cell size that they can on that first couple weeks, put on new foundation.
Or foundationless.
Or foundationless, absolutely. Now, large bees on foundationless don't usually go to 4.9 right away.
I find 5.1 or 5.2 usually.
Yep. That's what I've seen too, especially with bees that I know came from an apiary on standard foundation. Now, I've had luck a couple times and got a couple good swarms here in Wisconsin that drew out 4.9 comb right away, and those have been some of the best bees I've gotten. Clearly survivors, clearly already small, and I've got one that I got 3 summers ago that's still going strong, produces 100 pounds of excess honey every summer. But most of them aren't like that. Most of the colonies I get here are from managed hives. That's the state of where we're at here in Wisconsin. We have a lot of people move their hives into this state during the summer to take advantage of the summer honey flows, and then they move them south or move them to California and cycle every year. So a lot of swarms here in the Midwest are from those migratory hives. And so when you get those bees, you have to size them down.
Right.
Couple tools.
It's never taken me more than a couple of months to size large cell bees down. Just, you put them on 4.9 foundation, 9 times out of 10 they'll draw it, and by the time the next generation of bees is hatched out, they're all small. If you get this 10% or so that want to draw the comb wonky, what I'll normally do is I'll just go ahead and move that wonky stuff they drew off to the sides and let them start building natural comb. And they'll come in about 5.1 or 5.2. I let them raise a cycle brood on that, and I'll end up with the intermediate sized bees. Then I'll start feeding in the 4.9 foundation, and the 5.1 or 5.2 intermediate bees have no problem drawing that at all. And unless I'm really unlucky and have a fat-butted queen, she'll go ahead and lay in it, and I'm home free.
Yep. Well, and along that same lines, now that I'm doing a little bit more swarm trapping, I really like putting out swarm traps that are completely foundationless. If I have some old small comb, I'll throw some in there, but it's more for the smell than anything else, because I want those bees, if they're large cell bees, I want them to draw out and raise some brood in something intermediate that first cycle. And then once I bring that swarm back here and introduce small cell foundation, I can get them sized down in half a summer.
Yeah, most of my bees are feral, so I have no problem with swarms drawing 4.9 right off the bat. I think I only had one swarm that wouldn't draw 4.9, and the initial nuke that I bought initially wouldn't draw 4.9 worth a darn. But since most of mine are feral, I'll put in a comb or two and a sheet of foundation on each side. And the reason I do that is a few years ago I had a comb in and the rest foundationless, and those bees went and built their comb diagonally across the frames. And I really, really want to kind of force them into having several parallel sheets of comb so they really get keyed to that and they don't decide they want to build their comb across the frames like they did one time. Now, it may not make a difference, but I haven't had it happen since.
Yeah, I do the same thing with my swarm traps. They're typically one nice frame of drawn comb, generally small cell, because that's all I have. And then the rest filled with foundation. Sometimes I'll put a foundationless frame or two in there between other things so that just in case things don't go sideways when I'm not paying attention.
So you fill your hive with your trap with foundation?
Yeah, I do.
Really? Okay. I'd always been afraid to do that because I had, read that the way they measure the cavity, I was afraid that they'd look at that and think, whoa, there's no room in here. So I'm glad to hear that works. I've always kind of been afraid to do that.
Well, the reason why I don't think it matters too much is because with foundation in there, you've still got unlike with drawn comb, you still have a large amount of empty space. Between the center ribs of the foundation, you're going to have upwards of 1 3/8 inches, and so there's. I mean, Jason Bruns does the foundationless, and he seems to have a really good take rate. But I don't seem to have a big problem with it, and so it just makes things simpler. And as far as regression, I never had things go better than after I had gotten a hold of some already drawn small cell comb. I bought some nukes from Don Kuchenmeister down in Georgia on small cell comb. And up to that time, I had some trouble getting my bees to draw the small cell foundation out nicely. They would often have, you've seen it, kind of like these spider web things running through where the comb tops, the cell tops are wider than the bottoms, and so eventually they have to kind of cover over some to make up the difference.
They'll scrunch a whole line of cells about every fourth or fifth row.
Yeah, exactly.
And they do that, and it gets them partially regressed. But I sure hate to see good foundation get drawn out like that.
Yes, exactly. And so when I was able to put a frame or two of small cell comb in there, and once that first generation of bees was raised in that comb, like from then on, everything just seemed to fall into place. And so that's why I put small cell comb in my swarm traps, and not just for the smell, but that does it also. But so that queen can really get to work in there quickly, laying as soon as she's able, and then that first generation of bees will be much better equipped to draw out the rest of the foundation that's in there the right size.
Well, Dee Lusby has said that when they go to build a new comb, they'll key on the old comb size and try to replicate it. So what you're saying makes a lot of sense with respect to that.
Well, great. I hadn't picked up on that.
I've seen evidence of that, or at least I feel I've seen evidence in that as I've taken, because I keep a couple old combs around that aren't, that are larger cell, but I'll keep them way to the outside of the box. And if I put a frame of foundation next to a comb of large cell, drawn large cell, even if it's 4-9 and my bees are small, they'll often draw out some of that wonky. So I think there is maybe some evidence that they can key to those adjacent combs with respect to size. And another point that was made a little bit earlier was this thing about the size of the cavity that the bees are looking for in terms of swarming. I've never seen a swarm avoid a cavity that's completely filled with drawn comb. In fact, I expect
that's a good point.
I expect they perceive that as a cavity that requires less move-in effort, we'll say, less work to get ready. I tend to think that they probably use sound and vibration to measure the size of the cavity, and it doesn't need to be devoid of wax or devoid of comb. But that's just my personal suspicion, since I know they'll move into a box that's full of completely drawn comb fairly readily too.
I'm wondering, have either of you ever seen a queen when she gets on 5.4 comb, a small cell queen ends up laying drones in the large cell comb, not drone comb, but large cell worker comb. I've had that happen a number of times. I'll open it up and get to an outside comb, which I'll tend to put any large cell comb I have, like some of my early stuff before I switched over to small cell on the outside, and I'll pull and it'll be full of drone. I'll go, oh no, I got a drone layer. And then I'll go into the smaller cell and they're all working. I go, my goodness, she's actually laying drone eggs in in the large cell comb.
Yeah, the biology on that, or what has been at least deduced and written about it, is that queen, as she backs down into the cell, she's making a measurement. And how that measurement works and how it results in fertilization of the egg or release of sperm as the egg is laid, or withholding sperm and not fertilizing as the egg is laid, is largely a function of her body sensing the width of the cell.
Right.
And to me, and I've observed this too, with small bees, right? Small workers, small cell bees, my queens that those bees raise run smaller than I see on large cell. And you know, I've seen that because I've also had bees on large cell comb, and I get a lot of swarms with large queens. And I've had the same problem you had, Marshall, where I had a big fat queen and she wouldn't lay in the small comb. She's just laid in those outer large cell frames till she drove me about nuts. But yeah, that size of the cell matters, and I feel the size of the queen also matters. And there's a match in the size of the queen to the size of the workers, to the size of the comb, that's important for that distinction in whether to lay an egg and release sperm, which turns into a worker, or to lay an egg and not release sperm, which develops into a drone.
Right. Well, I'd read that they actually measure the cell with the two front legs. I had read somewhere where a person had a queen get injured, and she lost part of one of her front legs, and she became a drone layer because every time she'd measure the cell, it would appear big to her.
There you go. Yeah, I don't doubt that.
I had a queen one time that was missing one of the segments on her front leg, and I was concerned that they might reject her, but she seemed to be fine.
You're all right.
Well, you guys are the experts on dealing with the large cell comb. Like I said, I never had it. I did have back in 2004. Somebody gave me a hive that they were moving and they had to get rid of, and it was 5.2 millimeter. It wasn't the big 5.4 millimeter stuff. And they had kept it treatment free for a couple of years up to that point, and it survived another 3-4 years after that. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, there's that. There's, like Joe said, I also don't think it's a silver bullet thing. I think maybe our generation, Joe's a little bit older than me. This generation has been kind of set up to look for simple fixes and simple one-step solutions, and buying. I say this all the time. You know, you're buying your solution, buying your fix, buying into a certain program, and you know, like I say, there's no silver bullet in beekeeping. There is no single one thing. If you take treated bees and you decide not to treat them, you're going to have treated bees that aren't treated, and they're going to die. And I think the same thing goes with small cell.
They're bred to live with the treatment as opposed to the mites. So
exactly, they've been selected for it.
Now I have there's a few people here locally around me that I mentor, and a lot of times when people are starting to get into beekeeping, they don't want to wait for a swarm. They want to get a package of bees. And you know they're going to end up with a package of large cell bees 9 times out of 10. So what I've been doing with them is I'll donate 4 or 5 small cell drawn combs to them, since I have a relationship with them. I'm mentoring them. I want them to be successful. I want them to regress their bees as quickly as possible so we can move past this bee size thing and start to select for survivability on a small cell, kind of a small cell foundation. But I'll give them 4 or 5 combs to start their package on, and then I'll usually have them get some Man Lake PF 100 or 105s or whatever, mediums or deep, whatever they prefer. to get those bees sized down right away. And that has worked well for me. And then the next thing we do is when we've got a good flow on, we've got a good number of bees in that hive, kind of towards the end of June. If they don't supersede that package queen, then we'll force the supersedure, that package queen, and get the bees to raise a new queen off that natural, well, I shouldn't say natural, but off that small size comb in that hive, to then give them not only a new queen, right, for the rest of that season, but usually a slightly smaller queen, and a queen who, when she goes out on her mating flights, has a better chance of getting mated to some of the local feral bees and picking up some of that genetic component. So all in one process over a 2-3 month period, I help people get their bees, their large cell bee package started on small cell combs, so that within 30 to 45 days, the majority of their bees are small bees. And then we force them to raise a queen that's going to match their size and be well suited to laying in that small cell comb. And so far that seems to be working, having pretty good success with these first year packages getting through the winter.
Well, good. Sounds like way to go to me.
I was my eyes were opened very much when I was up in Wisconsin this last month, talking to the Mecklenburg County. No, that was the wrong one.
North Central Technical.
Yeah, I was at the North Central Technical College
at Wausau.
Yeah, in Wausau. And I got to talking to, there was one of the vendors in the foyer, and he was talking about, he's even got a truck, a special built trailer for a semi-truck that he goes down to, I think he said California, and he hauls back package bees, something like 8,000 packages at a time. And I'm just pleading with people, these bees from California or from Texas or Alabama or Georgia, wherever they're from, they're not really, they don't have winter like you do. You're going to see bees that go into winter with cluster sizes that are much too large, and they're going to want to starve to death. They're going to want to be brooding up too early in the spring, and they're going to want to starve to death because of that. Or they might, a lot of times they just don't have the ability to cluster properly, and so they'll die during the first winter freeze. So I really recommend people go for local bees. That's my local bee.
Oh, absolutely. Spiel. I mean, that's number one on my list is local survivor stock, and then number two would probably be cell size, and then things like unlimited brood nest and some of the other stuff that decals are.
But I think Joe's, as far as dealing with the bees that you have, I think Joe's program that he's talking about there is about one of the best that I've heard.
Yeah, because I want the bees to be small, and I want to get rid of that large cell queen and get that, and not because she's large, but because she's from treated stock. I want to get another queen in there, even if it's her daughter that's mated to the local drones. And in regard to size, that's another factor that I think there's an opportunity for research on. And there's some old research on this, but a smaller queen does tend to be mated more frequently by smaller drones.
Yes.
And a larger queen does tend to be mated more frequently by larger drones. Again, there is some research out there. It hasn't been done recently. You have to go back into the 80s, 70s, and the 60s for some of the really good basic biology on drones and mating of queens to drones. But it's out there, and if my local population of feral survivor bees are small, then my best bet of getting my queens mated to my local feral population of drones is to have small queens. And if there are 60,000 or 80,000 or 100,000 new packages of large cell bees coming into Wisconsin every year, plus all the people who treat and keep large cell bees, and I don't want my queens mating to their drones, if I were to keep the same bees on the same comb, what would I expect? I'd expect my queens to mate with their drones. But by keeping small
Very,
bees,
very good point.
by keeping small bees, I feel I have an advantage in getting mated selectively to those drones that I desire. That's, there's not a hell of a lot of research to point to on that, but there is a little bit. And I think there's huge opportunity for some good genetic studies to prove those kinds of theories. If a person could run a research program on anything but the efficacy of some treatment on mites, I think there's huge opportunities for some great biology that could help us to understand why people can be successful with small cell despite being surrounded by large cell commercial beekeeping.
That's something I've been...
Very, very good point.
Yeah, that's something I've been teaching lately. Basically, what we're trying to do with our treatment-free beekeeping and small cell and natural cell and foundationless, however you want to approach that, what we're really doing, in a sense, is putting feral bees into a hive, right? And the feral bees tend to affect the commercial bee population. Their genetics tend to bleed into the kept bee population, but the kept bee population genetics don't tend to bleed back into the feral population. I read that somewhere. I don't remember where it was exactly.
There are multiple research studies that back that up 100%.
Awesome. Great. So what we're doing, therefore, and we can do this more by adopting certain practices, is becoming interactive with the feral population and basically just becoming a part of the feral population and more or less ignoring the kept bee population, including the treated commercial migratory bees that come in and out of lots of areas in the country. And so I have had many commercial beekeepers and more conventional type beekeepers tell me that, the only way that you can be treatment free is if you're isolated from the non-treatment free population. Otherwise it won't work. And I'm going, I don't really find that to be the case conceptually or in practice. Because
it probably is the case if you aren't small cell.
That's probably
really
right.
Has to do with your bees being naturally sized.
At any rate, what's going on is that our smaller drones and honestly drones that have been raised without the effects of chemicals causing fertility effects, our smaller drones are out competing the bigger drones, especially for our queens that are also healthier and more fertile because haven't been exposed to chemicals and also raised in a smaller cell environment.
Yeah, and
I'm sorry.
No, I was just going to say queens that aren't treated tend to live a lot longer too. In my experience.
Marshall, go ahead.
Yeah, Dee contends that the smaller bees fly faster, that is, the small cell drones will fly faster, and the queens will fly faster as well. Now, I haven't read that anywhere else, and I don't know if there's been any research on that or not, but if that's the case, it would definitely support what you're saying.
Yeah, I've been having trouble finding any flight speed analysis, but in looking for that, I did find mating target information where they put phantom queens up in the air in a DCA of different size. And then they would bring those down periodically and collect the drones that were, because when the drone mates with the phantom, he gets trapped. And so they'd collect those drones and they'd measure their size. And that's a research in which they showed that the size of the target, the size of the queen, influenced greatly the size of the drone that successfully mated. But I'm still looking for some data, still looking for something on flight speed. But the reality is, we know with Africanized bees that they are smaller. And we know with Africanized bees that are smaller that they tend to outcompete European bees for mating European queens. Otherwise, we wouldn't have had an Africanization problem, right? So that's just true. And then there's a really good study on, I think it was in Germany, where they wanted to replace the German black bees up there, the wild bees, with a better strain. I think it was Carniolan. And what they found was that unless they isolated their queen rearing locations, they ended up with the vast majority of their queens mated to the wild black bees rather than to the drones that they wanted them mated to. So they couldn't do much better than maintain a hybrid bee between their desired Carniolan and the wild black bee in their managed apiaries unless they were completely separated. I tend to think that competitiveness of the local bees in those situations has a lot to do with their sizing.
Uh-oh.
Okay. Do either of you mill your own foundation?
I do not mill my own foundation. I have wanted to, but I haven't gotten around to it. It's a big expense that has a long, slow payback period, if you know what I mean.
Sorry about that.
I do mill mine.
You were asking about making your own foundation?
Yes.
Yeah, I did pick up a roller mill, and I make my own. I'm still not real good at it, not the best at making foundation, and you got to watch the temperature pretty closely while you're rolling it. I made some 4.4 millimeter foundation once. Yeah.
Okay.
It was a little too warm, I guess, when I was rolling it, and it shrunk a lot. Needless to say, my 4.9 bees didn't care much for it. I got a lot of wonky comb. But typically, if I keep my temperatures not too warm in there when I'm doing the work, I can get somewhere between 4.8 and 4.9 off of a 4.9 roller.
Do you make flat sheets first and then emboss them, Joe?
I do, yeah. I make the flat sheets, and I'm still looking for a tank to dip properly. Right now, I'm doing it in a way that I'm having trouble with the thickness. But you know, the beauty of having your own foundation mill for me has been there's a lot of people interested in non-standard hives. And so with top bar hives, for example, I can make foundation and put it in a top bar hive. And there isn't anything better to keep the comb straight when you're getting a new top bar hive started than to have foundation in it. But how many people can put foundation in a top bar hive? I can.
Not without wasting a bit of it.
Yeah. So I'm able to.
It doesn't matter if you waste it because you just melt it down and make some more.
Down and roll it out again. Absolutely. So yeah, I've been making foundation to put in top bar hives as a result of just having this tool. I probably make a couple hundred sheets of foundation a year. You can buy foundation pretty cheap. It's not expensive. I know my foundation is going to be a lot cleaner than the commercial stuff now because I'm, taking it from my own cutouts, taking it from my own cappings and so forth. So that's kind of a nice bonus, but it's a heck of a lot of work.
Yeah. Now I dip mine also. I did find out though that the paddle that you use, you really need to make a little oversized because it shrinks from that as it cools down, and then suddenly you find your foundation doesn't reach all the way down to the divided bottom bars, which is a problem I've had and that nobody had warned me about. So I do want to put that out there for people that are making their paddles for that. Now, as far as a tank's concerned, I use one of these really, really big turkey roasters, 24-pound turkey roaster, something like that. And I can put the paddle in there for a deep frame without any trouble.
Yeah, and I'm doing that right now too. And so you're laying your board onto the surface of the wax, not dipping it vertically down into the wax, correct?
Well, I bring it down horizontally, lay it on the wax, and then I pick it up, starting with either the front or the rear edge, and rock it up, bring it up vertically as I rock it up, let it drain, and then I dip it again, and the second time I tilt it the opposite direction so that, the first one's going to be a little thicker on one side, and then when I do the second dip, it's thicker on the other side, and now with the foundation with the same thickness all the way from one side to the other.
Yeah, and I'm doing the same thing, and I'm getting exactly the same result. I end up with those sheets, wax sheets, that are a little thicker on the edges and a little thinner in the middle. So when I push it through my roller mill and it stretches it, it tends to stretch the middle cells a little thinner. I don't get as good a ridge on the cell.
I haven't noticed that.
Yeah. And
what temperature are you running your wax at when you dip it?
Running at about 165.
62 or 3. And don't know if that'd make a difference or not.
Okay.
But, okay.
Well, what I'd really like to do is get a tank so I can dip vertically. I think that would solve a lot of my thickness problems. Or get a roller.
Let me suggest before you do that. Oh, I'm sorry, vertically.
Yeah.
Oh, so you get a sheet on both sides? Is that what happens?
You get two sheets off of a board that way.
Oh, okay.
And any difference in thickness is end to end, which instead of side to side, and so end to end.
That take a lot of wax.
Not really.
To fill it.
Oh yeah. It's going to take a lot of wax to fill it. I got 80 pounds of wax. I don't.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I've got enough to work with now that's not a problem.
Have either of you guys tried the extrusion method?
No.
That's pressing wax between two forms.
No, it uses a roller system similar to what you're talking about, but instead of starting with a pre-made sheet, and you can find if you look around on YouTube, you can find videos of people doing this. What you do is you make a form and you pre-make a bunch of wax billets, these kind of maybe an inch, maybe not an inch, maybe half an inch thick chunks of wax, and then you run that through a set of rollers, and instead of just embossing the cell on either side, what you're actually doing is you're squeezing that half inch and extruding it through the rollers.
Yep, seen it done.
And so you get a long, maybe like a 5 or 10 foot long strip of foundation rather than single sheets. You ever tried that?
Haven't tried that yet, and I don't have that type of a roller to try that, but it's something that I would probably consider. I've seen people use the extrusion technique like that, where they extrude with a roller that's only a couple inches away from their embosser, and they're extruding and embossing at the same time and making extremely long sheets of embossed foundation. And I tend to think that that's probably how they're doing it commercially. So I wouldn't really recommend a roller mill or anybody new into beekeeping thinking about this getting their own foundation roller. What I think is a better strategy, especially for the hobby level beekeeper or the small scale beekeepers, start out with whatever bees you can get. Hopefully you can get some swarms. If you can get small cell bees, get small cell bees. Keep them for a year or two on a small scale with small foundation until things stabilize, and then start converting to foundationless. I have such good luck with my bees drawing out nice small cell size after they've been regressed for a few years. I really hate when I put large cell bees on foundationless and get a bunch of 5.2 and 5.3 millimeter comb, because once I take it out of the hive, they keep rearing brood in it, and they're never going to get smaller. But once you have small bees, going foundationless is perfect. A lot of people these days go foundationless from day one with large cell packages and large cell nukes, and I just don't think they're going to get that benefit of the smaller bee until they've been doing that for 5 or 8 or 10 years and have cycled out all that larger cell comb.
Oh, absolutely, I agree. You've got to get them down by putting them on some small cell comb or foundation first, and at least get one generation of small bees building your foundationless, and then you're home free. If you try to go foundationless the whole, they approach small asymptotically or exponentially. They go down to 5.1, 5.2, then they go down to maybe 5.0 or 5.1, and then 4.95, and each time they do it, that's maybe another year, and it can definitely take 10 years for them to really get down to what we would consider the small cell or 4.9, 4.8 area.
And I get the question regularly, or at least concerns about the chemical content of purchased foundation wax, and I just want to say to people in that case, don't worry too much about that. I've been using commercially produced small cell foundation for 14 years now. It's done fine for me, and it's especially important to understand the fact that the wax is really the liver of the hive. It's a lipid, right? A fat. It absorbs things that are lipophilic, whereas honey is a water-based mixture, and it's not a mixture, but it's a solution. Anyway, and so the wax is going to tend to sequester those toxins, and so foundation is made from the best, newest, whitest cappings wax, and that's going to have the least amount of chemicals in the hive, and the bees are going to take that foundation and draw out and put a whole bunch more of their own wax on there, so you're going to further dilute any chemicals that are in there. So while it may not be absolutely optimal, like using your own wax, your own clean wax would be, it's not that bad. I have yet to see or have seen demonstrated any sort of deleterious effect from using commercially available small cell foundation.
Yeah, and I'll agree with that. And keep in mind that the concentrations of chemicals like coumaphos and fluvalinate and the active ingredient in amatraz, those things will never be any higher concentration than when you get it. And it will get diluted out every time they add wax to it, as you say, and every time you remove cappings, it gets diluted out even more. And it's not at a level that's going to be necessarily toxic to your bees. But if you're a treater and you keep using chemicals to treat your bees on a regular basis, then those things go higher and higher each treatment. And that's where cycling the comb out becomes the regular routine. I don't cycle comb at all because I don't feel that I need to. So I'm not adding chemicals to the hive. There's a steady state or a reduction in those miticides in any wax that I've purchased over time.
And also, if you're using a solar wax melter, like many of us do, and D. Lesby documented this a lot as well, when you're using a solar wax melter, the process of melting the wax in the sun actually degrades the chemicals to a great extent. So you're further helping yourself there.
Yep.
Well, I think we're coming up to the end of our time frame here. I'm going to be having some children come back here in about 10 or 15 minutes. So closing thoughts, Marshall?
No, not really. I can relate to kind of a funny story. When I got a swarm call Monday, has nothing to do with small cells. That's okay.
Oh, that's fine. Go ahead.
But it turned out this swarm had landed in this guy's backyard, and his next door neighbor was a beekeeper, but he'd gone over to his next door neighbor, and his next door neighbor was gone, so he called me. And I'm out there, and I hadn't made that bucket with a swivel on it yet. I just had a long rod with a hook on it, and it was up about 20 foot up on top of a holly tree, and I gave it a good shake, and 90% of the bees took wing, didn't even make it to the ground, and they took off flying. And when I was trying to get the queen where they landed on a tree, the queen took off flying again, and the second time they were flying over to a stump, this beekeeper came back over there, and he walks up and he says, "Those are my bees, you know." And I said, "Well, they're mine now." And at the time they were flying toward his yard. He says, "Well, if they cross that property line there, they're going to be mine again." Fortunately, though, they landed about 20 feet before they got to the property line, and I did get them. But I thought that was really, really funny.
It's pretty good.
Did he have a good attitude about it, or was he upset?
He had a good attitude. Turns out he didn't have any active hives at the time. Those bees actually had been his bees, supposedly, that had swarmed a couple years ago and landed in a bee tree that was about 40 feet from where I tried to pick them up the first time, behind the lot. So, genetically they were, descendants of his bees, but they really hadn't come from his hive. So he was good about it, but I thought that's kind of funny.
Yep. Joe, final thoughts?
Well, I'll make one more pitch for small bees, and it's a biology statement. The Varroa mite, as we all know, was native to Apis cerana. If you read up on Apis cerana, it's a quite small bee. I think average worker cell size with Apis cerana is in the 4.2 to 4.8 range. And that bee really has no problem with the mites. The mites can only reproduce on the drones. The mites don't and can't reproduce on the workers. And we know that the mite has also infested African honeybees. And African honeybees don't really have any trouble with it. And if we look at the natural size of African honeybees, they tend to run a little bit smaller than European, tend to run maybe 4.4 to 4.9 in that size range. And they have a little bit higher incidence of Varroa infesting worker cells, but overall they tend to be quite robust and do well without any treatments on natural sizing. European bees are the largest cell size bees naturally. They tend to run from about 4.7 to about 5.1 millimeter. And we run them even larger when we put them on 5.4 millimeter comb. And they tend on average to have higher infestation rates yet for worker brood than the Cerana or the African. And I really feel that there's a natural selection going on in our feral bees, selecting for smaller and smaller bees. And whether you believe that bees naturally were smaller before we put them on 5.4 foundation or not, the selection processes in nature for this mite that's most people believe is not native to the European bee, I think really are telling us that we need to make our European bees smaller to help us deal with this problem. We make them smaller like African honeybees that can deal with this problem, we all know. We make them smaller like Apis cerana that lived with this mite for hundreds of millions of years. And it's really not a controversy of whether the size, the small cell size is natural or not natural. Small cell size is part of the equation of varroa resistance that I think we all need to get in our heads and take advantage of when we can.
Very well said, Joe. I have been hesitant to promote small cell because I really didn't have maybe the evidence that I really wanted to be able to present someone a cause and effect relationship. And I think this conversation has helped me, if nobody else, has helped me to understand not only why I do it, but why I should do it and why other people should do it as well. And like I said, for a lot of our audience, is already foundationless, so this is kind of a moot point. But maybe there's a few people out there who could use the education. So, Joe, do you have anything you want, a website or anything you're working on that you want to tell us about before we go?
Not at this point. I think if people want to contact me, they can reach out to you, or I keep track of the treatment-free beekeepers page that you help to host and manage. Don't have my own website at the moment.
Marshall, anything you want to promote before we go?
Well, I do have a book on Amazon. It's Kindle only.
Okay. What's the name of the book? I'll put it in the show notes.
It's Treatment and Chemical-Free Beekeeping, the Natural and Organic Way.
All right. That sounds great. Well, thank you, gentlemen. It was really great to have you on the show today. I think it was this fantastic episode, chock full of information, theory and fact and anecdotal evidence and all sorts of studies and practices. And anyway, it's a great, great show. I appreciate you, both of you, having taken the time out of your day today on tax day to get this recorded.
Enjoyment.
It's been fun. Thanks for having me.
Thanks a lot. We'll see y'all next time.